A Shalom Akim Shalom Shalom. All praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, Ba'ashem Kakodash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone for teaching us his truth, and salutations to the sincere Akim and Aquathim and listen. May the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Brother Akwai, back in here with another quick and Lord's will is always an edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, I just wanted to discuss how Babylon, speaking of Babylon the Great, also known as America, separates sex from responsibility, right? Babylon the Great separates sex from responsibility. And what do I mean when I say that? I mean in the sense of it promotes a culture where it's all about excessive pleasure and there is no responsibility tied to that type of pleasure, right? It's essentially we live in a culture that is all about pleasure island. It's about getting your freak on, doing a three-way, and a lot of these mindsets, it's popularized in media, and it even trickles down into, the music also. The music also has a hand in the way it's all about sex without the responsibility, right? Because the purpose, really, when you think about it, of sex is to join together with your wife, right? Your significant other, and then eventually to bring forth children out of that union, right? So earlier, um, I was looking up the word contraceptive, and contraceptive, when you go into it in the etymology, let me just go up. It refers to, it says in a noun, it says birth control, prevention, conception in the womb. So it says Latin. Latin is the first portion of the word. It says contra, which means against. So, and then the ending is ception. So it comes from the root conception. So I guess it's essentially, it's a compound word. So you have contraception, which means essentially to be against conception, right? Which really, when you think about it, it's really when you strip it away, it's really truly satanic, right? Because how do you bring forth life if people use contraceptives, right? And this is the type of pleasure that I'm referring to, because when I was growing up, for example, there was a series of movies known as American Pie, and it was all about the dudes. They always wanted to try and lose their virginity. They always were trying to hook up and so on and so forth, and there was never any sort of responsibility tied to actually that motive after the fact, right? So what I want to do is I just wanted to go through some precepts and kind of establish this premise, see what is it in the ancient times things were like back then, right? So before I start off, let me just get my disclaimer. I like to call this my disclaimer scripture, right? Because I'm going to go into some stuff, right? So this is because I don't want you know some overzealous Israelite to come on and think, man, I gotta multiply my wives and all this kind of stuff. Like, no, this is about understanding the condition of the battle that we're in today, right? And how much, and to compare it and contrast it with how things were in the ancient times, right? The culture that is, the law, statutes, and commandments. When you really look at it, you understand why it's imperative that it's implemented upon the planet Earth. Very, very important, because the system that we're living in is not bringing forth life, it's actually bringing forth death, right? So This is the disclaimer scripture. This is Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 16, and it says, be not righteous over much, neither make thyself over wise. Why shouldest thou destroy thyself? Right? So, and here's some things, right, in regards to the way the culture was in the ancient times, right, and how things were very, very, and vastly different, right? This is not to, anyways, I'll get into it and you'll see why I'm bringing this precept out, right? So, let me first discuss how things are present day, how Babylon the Great is the way people live in this culture, right? So let's go to the book of Revelation. This is Revelation 18, verse 7, just to get a kind of a mindset of how, Babylon is described, and kind of get to understand the way it's described. It's very much in the same sentiment of how the people conduct themselves. So this is Revelation 18 and 7, and it says, how much she hath glorified herself and lived deliciously, so much torment and sorrow give her. For she saith in her heart, I sit as a queen, and am no widow, and shall see no sorrow. Therefore shall her place come in one day, death, mourning, and famine, and she shall utterly be burnt with fire. For strong is the Lord of power, who judgeth her, referring to Babylon the Great. This is the type of judgment that's going to fall upon her, right? Because people live in that same careless spirit, right? One of the things that is strongly despised about America is the fact that the philosophies that the vibe, those philosophies are given off from this kingdom, right? This is why a lot of these countries in the East, like when you read about Ezekiel 38 in regards to Russia and Iran, Ethiopia, so on and so forth, these countries, like especially in the Middle East, have a strong disdain for America because of those philosophies, right? Like I mentioned earlier, I'm not sure if I mentioned this, but there were some movies I used to watch when I was younger known as American Pie. And this is the kind of vibration that they live. And the scriptures talk about how, as is the king, so are the people, right? So just like how you see, you read about how Babylon is described here, living very deliciously, that's how a lot of these people live. Sex, drugs, rock and roll. That vibration of, much wine, they're super, super drunk, let's get wasted. This is the type of vibration. Let's get a threesome. Let me stick how many tongues down my throat and all this type of shit. This is the kind of way the people here live. And what I also wanted to touch on is the fact that in the 8th verse it says she shall be burnt with fire, because that's the judgment of a whore. When you go into Leviticus, the 21st chapter, that judgment is fire, and it's very, very poetic. It's the same judgment that's going to fall upon America, because a lot of these nations, even their own allies, are going to turn against America, right? So let me really jump into the meat here. I want to just establish that to get an understanding of how things are in this kingdom. How did the Heavenly Father set up things, right? So let me go to essentially, I guess you can say that we can call this the woman's perspective, or you can call this the man's perspective of how sex and responsibility were strongly intertwined, right? So I just have an example here in regards to laws on morality. So this is Deuteronomy chapter 22, One second. Let me just start at. I'll start at verse 28. And it says, if a man find a damsel that is a virgin, which is not betrothed, right? So she's not promised to anybody, right? And lay hold on her and lie with her, and they be found, then the man that lay with her shall give unto the damsel's the damsel's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, because he hath humbled her, and he may not put her away all his days. So if a man did this, you see a nice damsel, he takes her, he lies with her, his responsibility now, he has to pay that sum of that sum of money, right? He has to pay those 50 shekels of silver, right? That was a hefty responsibility. That's a hefty amount of money. Now you have to pay that, right? So before I continue real quick, I just wanted to actually look this up in ChatGPT earlier. Hold on. Just bear with me on this. Okay, so I wanted to type this in ChatGPT real quick, just to kind of get an understanding of the responsibility portion. The it could be a lot more than this. That's just but I'm just bringing this out for edification, right? Just to show you the financial responsibility number one of this portion, where sex was strongly more intertwined with responsibility, right? In the ancient times, right? So I typed this into ChatGPT. How much would 50 shekels of silver, as mentioned in Deuteronomy, be worth today in US dollars? Right? So it says the answer is approximately 700 USD. One biblical shekel was approximately, from what it's saying, I'm just reading off ChatGPT. It says 11.4 grams of silver, right? So it says, in summary, 50 shekels of silver would roughly approximate to 700 USD today, based on current silver market value. Like I'm saying, this is just for edification, just to understand how much of the financial burden a man had to pay. It was probably a lot more than this, right? Because they're using current silver market today. You have to factor in silver. It was a lot more pure, back then, right? As opposed to the way Esau does things. He sometimes mixes the metals, and he begins to there's a word for it, where it's called debase, right? We start to mix it with more inferior metals, just to keep that in mind. But I'm just bringing this out, like I'm saying, just for edification, right? So let's just say this is correct, right? So a man would have to pay approximately 700 USD for every time that, he took on a damsel that was not betrothed, right? And now you're tied to the responsibility of, like, okay, now I have to pay this, and now she's my wife, right? Because he hath humbled her, like reading verse 29 again. He hath humbled her, and he may not put her away all his days. So it shows you, in the event these situations happen, there was a responsibility tied to sex. It wasn't just about a man, like how you see it in hookup culture today. Hookup culture glorifies the sex portion, right? Let me go smash 50 baddies. You run the risk of, getting a girl pregnant, and that man may not be financially well off to be able to take care of that woman. This is why, this is why culture is so heavily important. Like, when you go into the story of our forefather Jacob, he had to actually work a certain amount of years, then he acquired his wife. Then he acquired Leah. Then he worked again and he had to acquire Rachel. He had the substance, right? It wasn't trying to acquire, you know, what's it called? You're trying to run without actually walking first, right? You learn how to walk and then you learn how to run first. You acquire the substance, now you're able to take care of the woman, right? It was always some procedure to it. This is why, like I'm saying before, culture is so important. Now, remember the precept I read earlier in regards to disclaimer, right? This is not to tell brothers to, if you're feeling overzealous, all things are lawful but not expedient, right? But I'm just showing you this is how things were in the ancient times, right? This is how there was proper conduct. It wasn't just glorifying this heavy this heavy vibration of sex in your face, sex in the music, sex in the media, sex in the music, sex in the sex in the gym, right? It's constantly you're constantly bombarded with this notion, right? This vibe, right? There was a responsibility also tied to it. Now, when you think about it, also why this law is put forth in place. Now, when a man does this, okay, the woman has a husband, a man now has his wife, he has a responsibility, right? And the union, the child that is conceived within this union, right, now has both of their parents. You now have a stable household, right? What happens when in this society when a man rapes a woman or whatever, right? Man goes to jail, he gets punished, right? Sometimes the woman has a husband. That's number one. You never know, right? Right. Another thing is the child that might be conceived out of that union. Now that child doesn't have a father, so now you have a generation growing up with children that don't have their fathers, right? Because of that union, the man is demonized, so on and so forth. At least this way, the Lord set it up to have these laws put forth in place. That way, you know, everybody essentially is taken care of. The man has a responsibility, he has to take care of his wife. The woman has a husband, she has her duty, right? And then the child has both of their parents. That's ideal, right? That's a family still intact, right? So, I just wanted to touch on that. Now, I wanted my next precept, I believe it's in Leviticus, right? So we're just discussing a little bit more of the ancient way of how things were. One second, I think it's Leviticus. Hold on. No, one second. Okay, this is Deuteronomy, so going into more of the woman's perspective, right? Women couldn't just be whores, kind of like that whorish culture that is strongly promoted today. So this is Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 17, and it says, there shall be no whore of the daughters of Israel, nor a sodomite of the sons of Israel. Right? So there was a certain level of holiness and conduct as a people we needed to be as. Now, when you going back into the description of how I described Babylon and the way people live in Babylon, this is the complete contrast of you see how our young women live. And our women, they live like whores, right? Babylon is described as a whore, right? If you don't believe me, you can read Revelation 17, right? Come and see the judgment of the great whore that sits upon many waters, right? This is the type of vibration that is pushed upon the women now. And again, It's glorified in the music, the media, the movies, right? Celebrities endorse it, come and talk, talking about their wet ass pee, right? Meanwhile, they go home and they have their families, they have their husband, they have their children, and so on and so forth, right? This is why the scriptures talk about the leaders of the people. They cause you to err, right? This is the vibration that they push, right? But looking at from the woman's perspective, this is the way a lot of our women live because of the culture. The culture is it turns you Israelites into degenerate plants, as it says in Jeremiah, right? So this is not conducive environment that is bringing forth life. When you look at, excuse me, the landscape of how men and women dating culture is so polarized, it's so polarized to the point where you can't even bring forth families, right? Because the men don't want a woman that's a whore, and the woman, they're disgruntled because they've taken on those fruits of essentially the serpent. They were beguiled by the serpent, right? Get a job, go to university. Make myself to be more like a man, rather than to actually take on feminine quality, wifely household duties that make me more attractive. They don't take on this vibration, right? So I'm going through this to show you, there was a standard in the ancient times of how things were, right? That actually brought forth life. There was an order, there was proper culture, there was proper uprightness, there was a standard, and we weren't supposed to take on the vibration when you think about it, because all this vibration is just really glorifying all these different gods, without these people, especially our people, knowing it, right? Um, so tackling the men, as well as the women, let's go to Isaiah here. This is Isaiah 55, verse 8, and it says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord Yahweh. For as heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts," right? I'm reading this to show that, when you go into the culture, the laws, statutes, and commandments, the way the Lord gave us to conduct ourselves, this is what's strongly needed on the planet Earth to bring forth righteousness. Because the hookup culture, this manosphere culture, it's not leading to anything productive. It's just, these people are literally just, they think, for them to establish a podcast is bringing forth answers. No, it's not bringing forth any answers. The answers is to, the Lord to come back and to establish a righteous kingdom where the laws, will be issued forth, right? Because this is what's important. This is what the earth needs. The scriptures say the multitude of the wise is in the welfare of the world, and this is what the earth needs, because you can't bring forth families. You can't bring forth children in an environment where they're pretty much kind of like at risk, and then men are wondering about their a society that benefits the women. Everything is just basically turned upside down. This is why the Heavenly Father's ways are higher than our ways and our thoughts. We're just, basically, we need righteousness upon the planet Earth. That's what is strongly needed upon this planet Earth, right? So, I'm kind of jumping around here. I kind of just wanted to hit a essentially a a perspective on how sex and responsibility were so closely more intertwined in the ancient times, right? A man, he would, as a matter of fact, I'll get this in Genesis. I didn't have this written down. This is Genesis chapter 24, verse 67. And it says, "And Isaac brought her into his mother's tent and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her, and Isaac was comforted after his mother's death," right? So after he took her, he slept with her, and they became one flesh, and she became his wife. And what comes forth from that, children, right? The scriptures describe how children are essentially a heritage of the Lord, right? Happy is the man that hath his quiver filled with them, right? But look at the nature of this kingdom. It's all about pleasure without the responsibility. That's why they introduce, like I was bringing out earlier, the contraceptives such as condoms and birth control, because what happens when the men and the women take that, right? It's essentially it's stopping it's taking away the responsibility and adding in the pleasure. Much pleasure. Let's bring in the pleasure. Let's put more pleasure. Let's put more pleasure. We don't want any responsibility. We can't think about pregnancy tests. We can't think about babies. We can't think about diapers. It's too expensive, and that's another aspect to the how messed up this culture is, right? It's not incentivizing people to actually bring forth families. It's incentivizing them to, adopt an alphabet lifestyle, to essentially, um, scoff at men, bash men, so on and so forth. It's just a polluted lifestyle, right? That's why the scriptures say, "Come out of her, my people," right? It's not bringing forth any sort of answers or any sort of direction of how to even operate a society. Esau has really done a very fine and dandy job of destroying these people, especially our people. Let me get that in Sirach, and I guess I'll close it off. This is Sirach chapter 10, verse. I'll start at 1 and I'll read down to 3. This says, "A wise judge will instruct his people, and the government of a prudent man is well ordered. As the judge of the people is himself, and so are his officers. And what manner of man the ruler of the city is, such are all that dwell therein." So you see the way the people conduct themselves because of the vibration that is pushed forth by Esau, right? The soul that's with him is not upright. So what a lot of these elites do, what a lot of these celebrities do, they push that in their music and it trickles down to the people. And this is the way that people live. Sex, drugs, rock and roll, popping pills, Percocets, lean, and all this type of shit. Excuse my French. This is the way they live here. Pleasure. It's Pleasure Island, right? Verse 3, and it says, "An unwise king destroyeth his people," because people are not thinking about trying to bring forth life and responsibilities. When you think about, you know, um, continuing the bloodline, heritage, you know, uh, um, family oriented, this culture doesn't promote those sentiments of continuing legacy. One of my favorite shows was Game of Thrones. They always understood the importance of family. Your house, bloodline, heritage. These were the things that they fought for. when you look at the culture, people don't think about those things. They're thinking about here, right now. I'm just trying to make it till next Friday. That's what they're thinking about. That's all they think about. Thank God it's Friday. That's the mindset of these people, right? So, um, that's pretty much it. I don't think I had anything else. I might make a part two to this, but yeah, this is summarized. This is the way Babylon conducts itself. It's a culture that separates sex from responsibility, as I've shown right earlier, right? And what is the conclusion of that is you have a society where people essentially never grow up. And then when you look at the nature of these societies, like Babylon, that follow after her ways, so you look at, for example, Canada, the UK, South Korea, Japan, so on and so forth. These countries are all suffering from low birth rates. You can't. It's not essentially conducive. Their ways of living is not conducive to life, family, and continuing the population, right? So, anyways, I sincerely pray this lesson was edifying. I just like to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashim Yahushai. Until next time, I say Shalom.